Thank you all so much for being here early in the morning. I'm Brandy Bourne with UNC Asheville, The Big Crafty, and Horse and Hero. Thank you. Our speaker today, it's hard to know where to begin with his CV. I mean, I want to read the entire thing because it's all amazing. But I'll hit some highlights. He's currently assistant state archaeologist for North Carolina. He's located here in Asheville, down Tunnel Road. His research has taken him all over the world. He has an MA in Latin American Studies from Tulane, a PhD in anthropology from Harvard. But I know him from his teaching days at UNCA, where he completely captivated his classrooms and has such a generous spirit, and I knew that he would be the perfect person to speak on the idea of depth. So pleased to introduce Dylan Clark.
Thank you so much, Brandy, very much for that kind introduction. And Justin and Brandy, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. Such an honor to be with you today at Creative Mornings. What I'm hoping to do today is talk with you a little bit about what is inspiring and meaningful to me in my work, or through the lens of what I do in archaeology, but also my goal is to maybe inspire you all, because I think y'all are probably more creative people than I am, ultimately, and I'm hoping that you might be inspired, or something will spur your curiosity, or maybe inspire a question or something that you want to pursue. I want to start, I think, with just a little background into what got me into archaeology to begin with, and how this whole journey started for me. Many years ago, in 1998, I think is where this started. So my glory days, the 1990s. I was an undergraduate student at Western Michigan University. It was also a good year for archaeology, for other reasons as well. But I was a budding anthropology student in Western Michigan, and I signed up for an archaeological field school. Now, the field school is like where you start. That's like where every archaeologist starts, right? You have to take this training course to learn about the methods and practices of doing archaeology. And the site that we were working at was called the Warren B. Shepherd site. It's a mid-1800s farmstead site, one of the earliest Greek revival houses in Battle Creek. It kind of looks like a haunted house now, but in this picture anyway. But at the time, it was going to be up for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And so we were hoping that archaeology might help to provide some additional information to support that nomination. So we were going to do an excavation here at this historic homestead, which dates to the mid-1800s. And I was super psyched, right? This was my first archaeological excavation, and I was hoping that I was going to find some really cool artifacts from the 1800s, maybe some transfer print pottery, or some early tools or toys, or something that's related to this family, because this is a very historic family in Battle Creek. Warren Shepherd was actually the first schoolmaster or educator in Battle Creek, Michigan. And if you've ever been to Southwest Michigan in the summer, in early June, it can still be pretty cold. It's cold and wet and rainy. But we went out there anyway to do this excavation, and we gridded off the site, because that's what you have to do. You have to put down a virtual grid of squares at any archaeological site, so that you can carefully control the location. You have to know where you are at any time when you're excavating down into the deeper layers. And so I had this excavation unit right here close to the house, and I thought I was going to find some amazing things. And so we were excavating, and I was digging down, and my professors were coming over and looking over my shoulder, and this was my first excavation, so I was really nervous and I was sweating, and the teaching assistant was there watching me, and they said, take it down another 10. Go down another 10. That means go down another 10 centimeters carefully. And I was using a trowel to scrape down through the reddish brown soil, and it was starting to smell very fertile and rich. And then there was this soil change. It started getting dark, and we were screening the soil in this in this type of screen with this 1/4-inch mesh. And you dump the soil in there and you shake it when you do archaeology so that the artifacts, the material culture that's left over will shake out into the screen. Of course, we weren't finding anything in my excavation area. Nothing, right? Totally sterile. I wasn't finding anything. We're digging down a little bit deeper. We get to this dark soil, and all of a sudden I start to see a shape start to emerge in the corner of my excavation square. And I'm very excited. What could this be? It's this reddish dark stain starts to come up, and I'm like, this is it. I've got an artifact. This is going to be great. And then all of a sudden I realize what I've got is this broken ceramic pipe, which you might have seen something like this, like a pretty thick terracotta water pipe. Probably dates to the late 1800s or something like that. And I was kind of like, well, frankly, I was underwhelmed, okay? This wasn't anything like an artifact that I'd seen in a museum when I was a kid or anything that was shown in slides in my archaeology classes, right? This was just like this water pipe. And I was thinking it may be kind of like a sewer pipe because it smelled kind of dank. And so I'm looking at this and I'm not too impressed. And my professor comes over and looks in the unit and says, wow, this is a fantastic find. You need to document everything. And I was like, what? What do you mean it's a fantastic? And they said, don't you know what this signifies? Don't you know what this object means? Think about its historical context, right? This is a water pipe that comes out of a house that was built in the 1840s and maybe was representative of the first time that this rural family got connected to a larger city and community, right? Because before that, this was a rural place. They just used well water and they had their outhouses and all of these things. But this pipe represents a kind of connection, right? Where the flow of water would be connected to a larger community. And maybe there's like a government system that is overseeing the use of water and drainage and all of these things, right? And my mind was blown, right? I was like, wow, now I'm hooked. Now I'm totally, I'm on board. So that started my 20-year career in archaeology, was finding this broken, kind of crappy artifact, but that has this very rich and I think deep historical context. And so that sort of started me on this path that has turned into this 20-year journey, sometimes exciting, sometimes fun, sometimes frustrating, in archaeology, and I'll explain why. So after that, I was lucky enough to go and do a lot of fieldwork and research in Mexico and Central America, and in graduate school, and now I'm back here in Asheville as the assistant state archaeologist for the western region. That's the western 23 counties of North Carolina. And we are part of the State Historic Preservation Office in the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. And we have registered at OSA over 60,000 terrestrial and underwater archaeological sites and historic cemeteries in the state. And the number really grows weekly because people, including citizens and members of the public, they discover archaeological sites or find the remains of historic activities on their landscape, and they submit site forms to our office, and we register those sites. And the goal is to protect and preserve these archaeological resources for the future, right? So my job is to help implement the federal and state legislation to protect these sites. And of course, all of us who are here, we know what an incredible physical and cultural landscape we occupy here in western North Carolina, right? Here in the southern Appalachian foothills region is a place of dramatic changes in elevation, right? And the physical landscape, we're constantly moving up and down as we move through the landscape. It's also a very important cultural and historical landscape, as you know. This is, of course, the ancestral homeland of the Cherokee people, right? We have to acknowledge and respect the fact that we are on native land, right? Over 14,000 years or more from time immemorial. This is the place of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Cherokee Nation, and the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians. And a little bit further to the east, around Morganton, and a little farther on, the Catawba Indian Nation as well has ancestral connections, and Muskogee Nation. So this is a cultural crossroads. And you can still see vestiges of this incredible cultural legacy here on the landscape, right? And of course, Cherokee people are still here, but you can see the depth of their history in some of the places like Niquosi Mound, the Star Place, which some people call Franklin, North Carolina. You can visit that site and some of the other important spaces. So at the time that I was an undergraduate, when I started in this field, I didn't really know what archaeology was. I had just heard that there were, my dad said, the best classes I ever took in college were my archaeology classes. So I thought, well, I'll see if I can study archaeology. And I didn't know at the time that in the US, archaeology is a subfield, actually, of anthropology, right? Anthropology being the study of people in a holistic perspective, right? So we look at all of the different aspects of what it is to be human, our biological makeup, our language, the culture, and the traditions and the beliefs and the worldview that we have. Social and cultural anthropologists interview people and write about what they learn from engaging other cultures. And then, of course, there's archaeology, which focuses on the historical dimension, right? How people understood and experienced the world in the past, and what we might be able to learn when we can't necessarily sit down with people in person and ask them about what their experiences were like. But can we tell anything about what their lives were like based on just the material remains that they've left behind, the traces and residues of the human experience on the landscape? And I just learned this when I started as an undergraduate. And actually, I was down at I had gone down to the Chicago Field Museum right around the time, right after I did that excavation with the ceramic pipe. And I bought this mug. This is my Walk a Mile in Someone Else's Shoes mug. And it has all these different kinds of shoes from different cultures around the world. And I thought this was a really cool sort of symbolic example in material culture, right? Artifact. That has a function, it's just a mug, but to me, it has this deeper symbolic meaning, right? Because it says something about anthropology. It's what I love about doing anthropology is meeting other people from other cultures, learning about their worldview and experience, and collaborating with different cultures in my work. Not just collaborating with people in the present, because contrary to popular opinion, archaeology is actually a really social activity. There's a lot of group work, teamwork that goes on in archaeology, but also collaborating with, well, I think of it as collaboration with people in the past, right? When we're excavating their history, we're making a connection with those people on a deeper level, a deeper historical level. And we're engaging with the things that they made and they used in the past. So these are the types of artifacts or types of evidence that archaeologists use to try to understand past human experiences. And these include things that people make and use, musical instruments, trash is very, very useful because you can tell a lot about the human experience from the things we discard in our lives. Architecture, plant and animal remains, sometimes historical documents and maps as well, right, are integrated and very much in what we do. But I wanted to point out something important about historical documents and how archaeology relates to history. And that is that history, as my colleague Dr. Darren Waters, I think, may have mentioned when he was here presenting for y'all, history leaves out a lot of stories, right? We don't all make the news, right? We don't all, our names are not all in print. And sometimes certain voices have been intentionally excluded from the historical record. And the cool thing I think about archaeology is it's a way of kind of shaking out some of the untold stories, the things that don't end up in the documentary record, and only appear in the material things. It tells a part of the story that is not always presented to everyone in a very formal way in historical documents. And the other thing to keep in mind about archaeology, and I think this is something that I hope will maybe resonate with y'all here today as creative people and artists yourselves, is that anthropology and archaeology are both social sciences, but also creative endeavors. right? In other words, there's an interpretive or humanistic part of archaeology, which is just as important as the social science part of it, right? We use scientific techniques and we develop hypotheses and test them following the scientific method, the Western European scientific method, right? To do archaeology, but no matter what we do, no matter how hard we try, we can never access all of the information about the past. There's always holes in the story, right? There's always information that's missing. We only get a partial picture of anything, and we're trying to paint as best a picture as we can of what the human experience was like in the past. But it's never a full picture, and so we have to be creative in our thinking. We have to imagine ways that we might investigate the past and add more details into the picture that we're creating. And this is really an interpretive process, right? Archaeology involves a lot of storytelling. So what I like to tell my students actually is that like the X-Files, the truth is out there, right? There is like there's an objective truth to history. Something happened in a place. But all we can do is try to get there, right? Through whether you're using the historical documentary record or whether you're using the archaeological record, we can only approach that history or that truth to an extent, and we've got to fill in some of the details through our creative interpretation. Okay, so let's get back to the theme and see if we can make some connections here to archaeology, and I'll try to explain kind of what I was thinking. So depth is a measure of distance, of course, and we're going to talk about how archaeologists have to measure the stratigraphy and move down deeper under the layers to try to get at the material remains of the past. Depth is also a space that denies easy ways of seeing or comprehending, and that was kind of what I'm getting at, right, with this interpretive aspect. There are always gaps in our understanding, and so we have to try to fill those gaps in as best as we can. Archaeology also, the other thing about archaeology, and some people think this is like it drives them crazy. I think it's kind of cool. We borrow like everything from every other discipline you can imagine, right? It's all fair game for archaeologists. We use all these kind of tools that are supposed to be used for other things, like dental picks and trowels, and like even these Gerber baby jars. Those are great for collecting organic material and carbon for radiocarbon dating and stuff like that, right? So we're like walking around with our tackle boxes, and people are like, what, are you gonna go fishing or something? And it's like, no, these are all do you need to borrow a dental pick? I've got an extra one here. And so we're borrowing like software, geographic information systems, more technical stuff like ground penetrating radar and other geophysical techniques. We incorporate those things into archaeology to try to, again, develop new ways of trying to piece together what was happening in the past. And one of we also borrow theories and ideas from other disciplines as well, right? So one of the fundamental theories in archaeology that I think relates to the theme this week is this notion of stratigraphy, which was borrowed. It's like a really early idea from the 1600s that we borrowed from geology, which is this notion of superposition, that things that are lower, deeper, are earlier than things that are closer to the surface, because the layers of the earth build up in this natural way. So that stuff in stratum A is supposed to be more recent or younger than the things that are down at the bottom. So this is the idea of stratigraphy, and it gives you the vertical context, right? It's the time. So where things are located in the vertical space tells you something about their time period, right? Their temporality. And I was fortunate enough to do an excavation in Yucatan at a site called Chunchucmil. It's this very large ancient Maya culture city in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it dates to around 600 to 800 AD. But this is kind of an example of, you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Like this was, you could see the surface, you could see the ground surface, right? And this is a pretty flat area. This isn't like a big mound or like a pyramid structure or something like that. You don't see anything. And this was just like a cornfield that we were working in. But when we started to remove the layers very carefully and we peeled off the upper stratum, we started to see the remains of what looks to be a house, right? It's an ancient Maya house. It has a stucco or plaster floor. It's got these doors that lead into other rooms. And you'll notice that one of the floors is a little bit higher than one of the floors that's a little bit lower. And so the theory, right, is that this floor might have been used at a later time, or the things that we find on that floor might be later than the things that we have found in this deeper floor. That's one of the ideas based on stratigraphy, right? Of course, it's not that simple. It can never be that simple, right? Things get messed up and mixed up all the time under the ground. There's a lot of ground disturbance, things like floods of these major rivers out here. The 1916 flood in Asheville, for example, it adds all of these layers of alluvium, and it kind of like turns the layers that are at the bottom up onto the top. Things like plowing or grading, even forest fires, animals burrowing in, they take things and move them around. So of course it's not that simple. And when you start to peel off the layers as you move deeper, the story becomes very, very complicated. It's difficult to sort of piece it out. You have to try to tease out the different layers and try to make sense of what you're looking at, right? So we talked about the vertical dimension, depth. There's also the horizontal dimension, which is really important as well. This is why when we do excavations, we are very careful about plotting exactly where things are located in the vertical and the horizontal dimension, because in the horizontal dimension, we're looking at how things like artifacts and architecture, they relate to each other spatially, because that tells you something about maybe human activities in a place, how they organize their space, how their activities, where their activities took place, how they relate to each other. So we can look at a site like this is a Maya coastal site that I worked at for my dissertation research called Islas Cerritos. And this is a house foundation and rooms in a house. And so you're looking, this is a plan view, means your bird's eye view. You're looking at this, and it's all divided up into these squares. And that's so it's like, you know the game Battleship? Did anybody play Battleship? And you have to tell, you know, it's in 21, and then you put your, if in 21. So we're carefully marking the location of all of these artifacts and material remains in order to be able to understand their relationships, right, in space. So the horizontal dimension is about like relationships at the same time or roughly the same time. The time period overlaps. Okay? It's often easier to reduce people, places, and ideas to flattened renderings. This is a really interesting idea, rather than grapple with the nuanced and contradictory truths found in their depth. So flattened renderings, right? That horizontal space is just one of the dimensions, but there's the vertical as well. That's very important. And we have to tease this out. And one of my friends was telling me, you know, when I see the term flattened renderings, she said, I think of a caricature, like when you go get a caricature, picture done of yourself at the mall or something like that, you look different, or you're like, is that what I really look like for real? So there's something more to the story, and so we have to add that depth. So let's take a flat rendering here of a place that you all know pretty well, Asheville, North Carolina. This is, of course, West Asheville over here, and the French Broad River and the Swananoa River intersect at a very important place, right? The Biltmore property is here to the south. Shout out to Biltmore over here. And this flattened rendering, I want to add a little bit of depth. So we're going to add an overlay of a LiDAR image, a digital elevation model that helps to bring out the topography a little bit more. And when you do that, and you start to look at the map, you start to see a lot of traces of human activity on the landscape, right? You can see the highway, for example. You see the rivers. Well, the rivers aren't human, right? But the highway is human-made. You see some of the streets of West Asheville emerging. Some areas that you may recognize over here in the Carrier Park zone. And a very important place here at the intersection of the rivers on the Biltmore property. This is actually, you can kind of barely see, but it's a human-made earthen mound, the Biltmore Mound and Village site, a very important ancient Cherokee center. And there were important Native American towns and villages all along the river areas. But when you add that layer of depth, my point is, when you add that layer of depth, you start to see different things from different times become apparent and inscribed on the landscape, because we make these permanent inscriptions on the landscape that don't all go away, right? Sometimes they stay, sometimes they're overlaid with other layers that obscure them. Sometimes we blow them out with our construction and we add something else and it changes, but there's always like a little something that you can still see. And that idea is like this notion of a palimpsest. You may have heard of that palimpsest idea, the thing like where you like reuse something that was used before, and you can still kind of see a little bit of what was there before, but you've added these other things to it. And so all of these different parts of the human experience start to show through, but again, the picture is very fragmented. It's a partial picture. And I just want to mention one more thing, and then I'll kind of wrap it up and we'll open it up to discussion. But this is an old photograph I thought was really cool. Dr. Waters, when he was here, I remember he mentioned, the old photographic archives are cool because they show you a picture of Asheville that's no longer there, right? It's gone, it's different now. And this old photograph I think is cool because it shows Carrier Park from the perspective of an airplane that was coming to land on an airstrip. I just learned this last year, that there was an airstrip through the middle of Carrier Park. And there's also this like circle, and some of you may know that place today, which is where you go to do what? Ride bikes and work out, and it's the velodrome, is that right? The velodrome? But it's built right on top of the old Asheville Motor Speedway, so there was a racetrack there, and the cars had to like stop and let the planes land through the middle. But today, it's all kind of covered up, and it's a different type of community space, but still an important place that we are now, in the contemporary moment, reinscribing new experiences onto that place. And some of it shows through when they do archaeological excavations. Sometimes they're able to see traces of these earlier experiences. And people in our community maybe still remember what it was like at the Asheville Motor Speedway back in 1960. And they have that kind of connection, and maybe they return to see the velodrome today and have a kind of experience of remembering and commemoration in that space. Okay, so to wrap up, I just want to make a couple final points and then show you some takeaway points, and then we'll open it up. This slide, I just wanted to show some examples of like really awesome, fantastic artistic production that we see represented in these ancient works of art that we often see in museums. And that's fantastic, that's great. But it only gives you part of the story, right? What's missing is that larger historical context that comes through understanding the vertical dimension and the horizontal dimension. A lot of these artifacts were removed from their historical place. And when they're outside of that context, you don't have a really good idea of how the people incorporated these things into their daily life and activity. So sometimes looking at the small broken artifacts that you know where they came from in space tell you more than some of these really masterful works of art. Not to suggest that these are not important. These are wonderful and very important pieces, but again, it's only part of the story, and we have to try to fill that in interpretively. So finally, I'm just going to wrap up by pointing out that as you travel back further, and I'm thinking about traveling back further in time by going deeper, right? we're maybe really confused about what we're seeing because we're trying to like figure out how to tease out these layers and make sense of the material that we're finding. But in doing that, when we think about the connections between the deeper layers and the more superficial layers, we get a better sense of change over time, and that always ends up inspiring more questions, right? So archaeological projects always start out with a research question and a hypothesis that you're testing. You're trying to answer questions, and we do answer some questions, but we always end up with more questions at the end than we started out with at the beginning, right? The questions just change because we have this new perspective, this new viewpoint that challenges us to think about things in new ways. So to wrap up, things I'm hoping that you might take away and think about in your own creative life and your own personal social interactions as well, that evidence of the past in earlier times and inscriptions on the landscape may reveal some untold or obscured stories that need to be brought from the background into the foreground. And importantly, context, space and time, the space and time in which things are located is key to getting at the deeper meaning of things. And you might think about this in your interpersonal relationships as well, right? Think about where people's history and their relationships horizontally, how that might influence their experience and your interaction with them. Consider how understanding the deep time connections that we have to places and communities contributes to what we're trying to build today in our community and thinking about for the future. I'm speaking to the converted when I say science and creativity are inextricably linked. You all know that. But also I think back to my mug, to walk in someone else's shoes, right? It's the ultimate goal of anthropology and archaeology is to try to understand someone else's experience at another time. And while that can be uncomfortable and very difficult, maybe unattainable ultimately, the attempt to attain that, to try to get there, is something that's very valuable and I think essential. So thank you very much.